The Mitford family, a very interesting one, a very controversial one, probably more controversial than the Kardashians, if I'm being honest. And they were one of the many prominent families in history. There was a communist daughter, a fascist daughter, a Nazi daughter, a traitor daughter, even one lesbian sister. So, how did this prominent family come to be one of the most controversial families in history? Well, on today's episode of People of History, I am going to be doing a whole overview on the entire family, and then I'll be doing individual episodes on the whole family. Well, the Mitford matriarch, patriarch, brother, and the sisters, of course, all in order though. But probably like I said, who exactly was this family? To answer your question, they were an aristocratic family that became well known in the 1930s, particularly the sisters. They were the daughters of David Freeman Mitford, who was the second Baron Redesdale, and his wife Sidney Bowles. And I wonder if she's a descendant of Camilla Parker Bowles. I'm getting off track, but she probably is. One journalist described them as Diana the Fascist, Jessica the Communist, Unity the Hitler Lover, Nancy the Novelist, Deborah the Duchess, and Pamela the Artruse Poultry Connoisseur. So let's give a little background to the Mitford family, because I think that's important, right? Well, the family will trace its origins back to Northumberland, back at the Norman conquest in the Middle of Ages, where they has been border rivers based on Resdale, and the mainland and its family was the seat of the Mitford Castle. The then Mitford Old Manor, prior to building Mitford Hall in 1828, all three are near Mitford, Northumberland, and several heads of the family are high sheriffs of Northumberland. A junior line with seats of Newton Park, Northumberland, and Exbury Park, Hampshire, descends via historian William Mitford, and were twice elevated to the British peerage in 1802 and 1902 under the title Baron Redesdale. And the branch of family to whom the Mitford sisters belong, were seated at Batsford Park, Gloucestershire, and then Ast Hall at Swinbrook in Oxfordshire. So let's talk about the siblings. Because there were 6 girls, 1 boy. Yep, 7 altogether. So the oldest one was Nancy, who was born in 1904, and she would marry Peter Rod, whom she subsequently divorced, and had a long-standing relationship with French politician and statesman Gaston Palaski. She lived in France most of her life, and wrote many novels, including a semi-autobiography, The Pursuit of Love and Happiness in a Cold Climate, and she was also a biographer of historical figures, including Sun King. She was probably one of the only normal Mitford sisters, if you want, depending on how we're going to define normal after we get done with this. Then there was Pamela Mitford, who went by Pam, who was born in 1907, and she was called Woman by all her siblings. John Birchman was in love with her and referred to her as the real Mitford, but she would later marry and later divorce millionaire physicist Derek Jackson, and spent most of her time in 1960s living with Gaudita Tomasi, who would die in 1993, who was an Italian horsewoman. Think we can figure out which one was which, right? Now, then there's the only son, because somehow, I guess they wanted a baseball team. There was Thomas David Mitford, who went by Tom, who was born in 1909. He was the only son that was educated at Eton, with an affair with James Lee Millane. He later had a lengthy affair with an Austrian Jewish dancer, Tilly Loesch, during her marriage to Edward James, and according to Jessica's letters, Thomas supported British fascism and was supposed to be in the Burma campaign after he had refused to fight in Europe. He would die in action. Then there's Diana Mitford, who was born in 1910, and she would marry aristocrat and writer Byron Guinness, 2nd Baron, more in 1929. She would leave him in 1933 for a British fascist leader, Oswald Mosley, who she married in 1936 and with whom she had two sons, Alexander and Max. The couple were interned in Holloway Prison from May 1940 until November 1943. Then there was Unity Mitford, who was born in 1914, who was known as Bobo to her siblings. And she and her sister called each other Bowed and developed their own language that they called Bowdelige. In her addition of her friendship with Adolf Hitler was widely publicized. She shot herself in the head just hours before Britain declared war on Germany, surviving but with permanent brain damage. In 1944, her family sent her to a Scottish island of Inchkenneth, where she lived out the war. She would die of pneumonia and meningitis at West Highland Cottage Hospital. Then we have Jessica Lucy Mitford, who went by Decca, um, who was born in 1917, and by her sisters, with whom she called the same name. Unlike the rest of her family, she was a communist. She would elope with Esmond Romilly to Spain to participate in the Civil War. There, subsequently, she would move to the U.S. On November 30th, 1941, during the air raid of Hamburg, Romilly's aircraft was lost over the North Sea, and she remained in the U.S. most of her life, where she would marry Robert Trubhoff and was a member of the American Communist Party until 1958. And she would write against volumes and memoirs in several volumes of polemical investigations, including the best-selling The American Way of Death about the funeral industry. She was the grandmother of James Foreman Jr. and Chaka Foreman, son of African-American civil rights leader James Foreman, by her daughter Constancia Romilly. Then there's the last of the Mitford siblings. There's Deborah Mitford, who went by Debo, and she was nicknamed Nine by her sister Nancy, and she married Andrew Cavendish, who later became Duke of Devonshire, and was one of the ancestral home of Chatsworth into Britain's most successful stately homes, where she wrote several books. I am most excited about this one because, as most of y'all know, I have an obsession with British royal history and aristocracy, and there is a duchess that we all know well, Georgina Cavendish. Yep, I can't wait for that episode. But let's talk about the family tree real quick, okay? The sisters did gain widespread attention for their stylish and controversial lives as young people, basically, and for their political divisions between communism and fascism. Nancy and Jessica became well-known writers. Nancy wrote The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate, and Jessica The American Way of Death. Deborah managed Chatsworth House and one of the most successful stately homes in the UK. Jessica and Deborah would marry nephews of Prime Ministers Winston Churchill and Harold Macmillan, and Deborah and Diana both married wealthy aristocrats. Unity and Diana were well known during the 1930s for being close to Hitler. Jessica turned her back on the inherited privileges and eloped with her cousin Esmond Romilly, who was hoping to report the Spanish Civil War in a new chronicle. And having briefly fought in National Brigade, Jessica's memoir, Odds and Rebels, describes her upbringing. And Nancy drew upon her family's members and characters of the novel. In 1981, Deborah became politically active when she and her husband, Andrew Cavendish, the 11th Duke of Devonshire, joined the new Social Democrat Party. Now, the sisters and their brother Thomas were the children of David Freeman and Sidney Bowles. To their children, they were known as Farv, and Mew, respectively. David and Sidney would marry in 1904. The family homes would change from Basburg House to Ashdale Hall Manor beside the River Windrush, and then Swinburne Cottage nearby, with a home of the Rutland Gate in London. They also lived in a cottage in High Review, Buckinghamshire, where they used as their summer residence. Now, their siblings did grow up in aristocratic country house, where they were emotionally distant in their parents, and the family dynamic was not unusual for an upper class family at the time. Their parents disregarded formal education for women, and they were expected to marry at a young age to a prosperous husband. And after the Nazi regime started the invasion of Poland, the Second World War would begin, and their political views came into sharper relief. Favre remained a conservative who long favored Neville Chamberlain's approach to appeasing Nazi Germany. Once Britain declared war, he returned to being an anti German British patriot. It continued with the fascist sympathies and usually supported her fascist children. Now, that was Mew. Now, the couple was separated in 1943 as a result of the conflict. Surprisingly, I'm not surprised. Nancy was a modern socialite who worked in London during the Blitz and informed her fascist siblings of the British authorities. Pamela would remain seemingly non political, although according to her sisters Nancy, Pamela, and Derek Jackson, they were anti Semites verbally during World War II who had called for all Jews in England to be killed. Tom refused to fight in Germany but volunteered against Imperial Japan, and he was killed in action in Burma. And Diana, who was a fascist, would marry Sir Oswald Mosley. Yeah. Unity was a devoted Hitler follower. Jessica was a communist. Now, Jessica was a communist who moved to the U.S. She had to immigrate so she could become part of the Communist Party here in the U.S. And there was a strong political rift between Jessica and Diane that left them estranged from 1936 until their death. And they did speak to each other in 1973, and their eldest daughter, Nancy, was on her deathbed. Aside from their estrangement, the sisters kept frequent contact with decades throughout after World War II, and the sisters were prolific writers and substantial bodies of correspondence that still live. Thank you for joining me. You can join me as we talk about the patriarch of the Mitford family on our next episode.